Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IPI Lunch and Learn CPD on MSP. And this series has been organised by the IPI Marine Spatial Planning Committee, and the aim is to give a general introduction and broad overview of marine spatial planning. The intention of this series is that it would provide a foundation for further CPD, and we will go into more specific marine topics in more depth that will contribute to professional practice in the area. I will be seeking your views on that towards the end of this series. But today we start off with an overview of marine spatial planning and a brief insight into marine spatial planning in other jurisdictions that will give context to the development of MSP in Ireland. On subsequent Fridays until the 1st of December, we'll be looking at the development of MSP in Ireland, and we'll have contributions from the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, from MARA, DEC, and On Board Planola. We'll be looking at transboundary MSP and also the experience of stakeholders. We will also have presentations from two planning consultants working in the area, and we'll have two Irish case studies, the Celtic Interconnector and the Shannon Estuary. I would like to thank the members of the MSP committee, because without them, this series wouldn't be happening. So I have to credit their commitment. And a testament to that is no less than 6 members of the committee will be making presentations as part of this series. We're delighted that almost 500 people have signed up, which shows the level of interest in this whole area. Thank you also to the Irish Planning Institute for the support it has offered the committee, and in particular to Sean and Shelley for their advice and for their backup. A particular thanks is due to the department for its support. Not only do we have 2 speakers from the department, but also, in addition, funding from the department has enabled an upgrade of the IPI website. And that means that this CPD series will be loaded onto the website afterwards, and it'll be a resource for everyone. It also means that we'll be able to add to it as further CPD progresses. So what we will be doing is we'll be recording these presentations, not the Q&A, but we'll be recording the presentations, and they'll be available afterwards on the IPI website. So the format for each Friday is we'll have 2 speakers. They'll make a presentation of about 25-30 minutes each, one after the other. And I'll be interrupting them at 25 minutes to let them know their time is nearly up. And we'll have a Q&A after that, a short Q&A, because we'll be finishing up at 2:15. If you have any questions, please pop them into the chat box and I'll pick up on them, and we'll see how many we can ask. We'll be putting some of those questions to the speakers. At the end of this session, a small evaluation survey will pop up in your browser, and that would be, please fill it in, because that would be, very important insight for us as we progress through this CPD series. Just to alert everybody that one of the speakers for next week, that is Dr. Anne-Marie O'Hagan, she was to give an introduction to marine legislation, but unfortunately she cannot present next week. But we will have one speaker next week, that is Ali Robinson, and Ali will be giving her presentation on seabed characterization. So our first presenter today is Dr. Heather Ritchie, and Heather's going to set the scene for us, and she will give an introduction to marine spatial planning. Many of you will know Heather, but Heather is a lecturer in planning in Queen's in the School of Natural and Built Environment. She teaches planning law and regulation across both the BSc and the MSc programs in planning and development. And her research area is on transboundary and stakeholder engagement in marine spatial planning. Heather's a member of the IPI, and she's also a member of the Marine Spatial Planning Committee. So over to you, Heather.
Thank you, Terry. I will just share my screen. Hopefully that is coming up for everybody. Is that looking okay, Terry?
Looks good, Heather.
Okay. So thanks so much, Terry, for that introduction. I think just to start a little bit about me, first of all. So really a little bit about my career background. I have a law degree from the University of Dundee. I then came back to Northern Ireland and did my master's and PhD in Queen's on marine spatial planning. And then I moved to Ulster University for 14 years and taught there, and actually just very recently have come back to Queen's just in May 2023. So it's been so lovely to be back, I have to say. And again, just not sure what order these pictures really come in, but just to say, very busy academic mum and do not get enough time in the sea. Really, on the Marine Irish, the IPI committee had a real realisation that there was so much need for marine spatial planning education. So we did come up for this CPD series. And what we wanted to do was to have some academic presentations together with practical presentations from our colleagues that are working in practice. So hopefully everybody will find this series enjoyable. I'll try to cover as much today as possible, but as we say, we are merely dipping our toes in the water here. So there is so much to cover. So what I want to do in this session is really just to cover some fundamentals. Looking at some key issues around, why do we need marine spatial planning? Some definitions, a little bit on property rights, the marine problem, and then some comparisons. And then what I've done at the end is included some key reading as well that you might be able to pick up on. And I think this opening phrase for me, that it's time to stop planning with our backs to the sea, has been so meaningful to me. I first read that as a PhD student, and that was from a Belgian research report called A Flood of Space. And it always has stuck with me. And just, we need to really adopt a different mindset for how we think about use of sea. And then very recently, I learned this term sea blindness, and that was from a lovely man called Peter Coyle from the Marine Renewables Industry Association. And he introduced this term to me a few weeks ago. And he said, Ireland really woke up to the fact that we are surrounded by sea in 2019. So there's been so much happening from then. This picture, I always seem to show this at different presentations and in lectures. And I think it really sums up a lot of, the key essence of marine spatial planning for me, because you can see the beauty of the seascape, the human and cultural aspects, recreation, technology of the turbines and energy security, and the land-sea interface as well. So it's really, really meaningful to me. Again, in terms of why we need marine spatial planning, just to highlight that everything we do on land has an impact at sea and vice versa. And land-sea interactions are so important. And my colleague Paul will talk about this after me, but also Ali will discuss that next week as well. And it's just to highlight some of the key terms here around health, the fact that the seas are a limited and scarce resource, although if you are from offshore renewables, you might have a different view. Very much this idea of public awareness and the need for state intervention, and a lot of recognition that there's a lot happening beyond the UK and Ireland as well in terms of our international efforts. And then just, demarcating that marine planning is a new vision for our seas. So why do we need it? Well, we have to. It says in law that we should have marine spatial planning. It's enshrined in this directive. And it really, the MSP directive in 2014, what this does is really integrated the maritime policy, the integrated maritime policy of 2007, which focused on the blue economy. And similarly, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive of 2008 was aimed at protecting the marine environment and reaching good environmental status. And really what this directive did was to declare that mandatory that sea-facing countries in the EU have a marine plan 2021. But it actually left the freedom to the member states to decide how to adopt their own. That's why they all look a little bit different, and we'll have a look today at some of those. And restructuring the sea, I think how we use the sea has very much changed over the years. We do still have our, traditional uses that might have got a bit bigger, but we've got this real new growth of a new sector. And together, these two sort of uses are really leading to many challenges. And there's so many institutional implications as well. It's almost been described as an administrative battleground. And I've got an image shortly that will really show this to demonstrate the hugely split governance arrangements for this. This quote, this is really referring to prior to the formal introduction of marine spatial planning. So this was from a consultant called David Tinsley Associates in 2004, and he said that marine uses previously were largely sectoral, reactive, application-led, centralised, remote, characterised by ad hoc planning, extensive duplication, inadequate coordination, integration, and limited information gathering, enforcement and monitoring. Now, hopefully we've moved beyond a lot of that now, but maybe that's up for debate. And I think really this sort of signified and identified the need for a new system of planning for the marine environment. And I guess, you know, very much at the start of the evolution of this idea, there was a lot of unknowns. I think we very early recognised that we couldn't just simply transfer the land use planning system into the marine environment. And there's so many different issues with different silos, very little sense of integration of activities. And then when we add boundaries and borders into the mix as well, then it just gets a whole pile more complex as well. So there's so many governance issues, and it's a very piecemeal, sectoral and complex environment. This image here, I have shown this a lot at lots of different presentations I've done. And I think really credit to Stephen Hull from APP Mayor. He needs to actually get royalties for the amount of times that this image has been shown. So this was created in 2006, and as you can see, it's 200 plus GIS layers of marine and terrestrial activities. And if you look very carefully, you can see that this is an actual outline of the Irish Sea. So you see quite clearly in the middle of the Isle of Man, Northern Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, and the Republic as well. Now, we imagine that that was 13 years ago. If this was to be updated today, this would be a whole pile even more crazy with many more lines. And I think what we need to do here is appreciate the 4D approach to consider as well, that we've got the air, the surface, the water column, and the seabed as well to consider. And I guess the major difference here with marine planning is that on land, activities are usually pretty fixed and defined, but it's so much less so at sea. And this really introduces the concept of multi-use and coexistence, which we're starting to hear more and more about. So really, we really are planning for busier seas. We know that we are facing more activities and more impacts, and that's led to even more conflicts and pressures on our sea space as well. So there really was a clear need for state intervention, but it had to be at an appropriate level. And that is why it is very different across the UK and Ireland, because we're all in different planning systems, different regimes, and operating at different timescales as well. And then once we take account of transboundary impacts as well, you can see that it gets very complex and very busy indeed. So I included this just a little bit of back to basics of who owns the sea. And again, this is something I've always talked about in some of my lectures on this, a little bit of academic history here. So there's a paper that I always refer back to by Russ and Zeller, and they really talked about Hugo Grotius and the doctrine of mare liberum. So I knew that my A-level Latin would come in handy at some stage, but it's really just this idea of, you know, the sea was considered as open access to everybody, and the notions of the seas being free and open to all maybe led to the over-exploitation and over-development. So really just the idea that Russ and Zeller posed that, you know, some people maybe thought that marine spatial planning would lead to like mare reservarum or even mare closum, but I can see that it's not just the case. But it is important to realise that maybe we think differently about that doctrine today. So I've included this photo that I took from Rathlin Island on the North Antrim coast. It's really beautiful, but really this is to show and to demonstrate the main differences with land use planning. So when we make an application on land, we need the ownership or the agreement of the owner that has to be sought. But here there's so many different implications now with marine spatial planning that really the implications for use by a private party for what is effectively a national property. So there's so many different implications here for the notion of the common good or the public interest as well. And then I guess the purpose of marine spatial planning, really the key here is to think about regulating and rationalising sea uses. And I think what's really important to recognise is actually the purpose of marine spatial planning has really evolved over time. And it seems that marine spatial planning is expected to do more and more, you know, taking into consideration transboundary impacts, the SDGs, climate change, and offshore renewable energy targets as well. And my colleague, Dr. Wesley Flannery, will talk about this in a few weeks. He's really going to challenge if marine spatial planning is doing what it set out to do. And I think then it's quite good to look at some definitions of marine spatial planning from planners. There are many different definitions, and I guess this is one of the earliest ones from my colleague Jim Claydon, who's based in Bristol. And really his definition came about from work that he was doing way back in 2005. There was an Irish Sea pilot, Irish Sea Maritime Spatial Planning pilot run, and that was actually run by the RTPI task force at the time, and they came up with this definition here that's really stuck. So this idea around integrated policy-based approach to regulation, management and protection of marine environment, including allocation of space that addresses the multiple, cumulative and potentially conflicting uses of the sea, and thereby facilitating sustainable development. There's so much in that. And actually, if you want to read more about that, Jim did a really good paper for Town Planning Review that really talks about that definition in more depth. And if we look at a few other definitions, we'll see some common themes here. So this is an international definition that was taken by a report that UNESCO did, and I've included the report actually at the end of the slides. And again, we can see the idea around, spatial and temporal distribution of human activities. We're talking about social objectives as well that are specified through a political process. And then finally, just an EU definition as well. Really, this is more of a legal definition, which we're probably quite familiar with now. Again, the ideas around analysing and organising human activities in marine areas to achieve ecological, economic and social objectives. So we can see the parallels across all those different definitions. And another maybe interesting facet to understand about the purpose of marine spatial planning is to look into this notion of the marine problem. And this is a bit of an academic idea. And again, as a complete self-confessed MSP nerd, this is a paper that I come back to again and again. And these were from my two mentors at Ulster University, so Deborah Peel and Greg Lloyd. And this is a paper I always come back to. There's so much in it. And the fact that it's written from a town planning perspective back in 2004 is really, really interesting. And I think what it does is really reinforces that there was a marine problem and a need for a solution as well. And it says that there are two strands to that problem. So an environmental strand and an institutional fragmentation strand as well. And I just put this photo up as well that I took, and that I took this standing on the shores of Lough Foyle, and thought it really encapsulated a marine problem. There are so many issues in this photograph, but that is for another day's debate, I think. So some of the common characteristics then of marine spatial planning. So if we take all those definitions together, we can really start to see the formulation of some common characteristics. And it's really, some of them are borrowed from marine spatial planning. It's terrestrial land-based cousin, and we can see those as, ecosystem-based, integrated, place-based, adaptive, strategic and participatory. And I think we should think of these as the sort of guiding principles for marine spatial planning. In terms of some similarities and differences, obviously we appreciate the key physical 4D dimension that we've been talking about, but also that there are many legal, cultural, emotional differences as well. But there are some key similarities as well. And I think the biggest thing is a desire to make things better. So if we look a little bit more in depth, we see some of the fundamentals actually of the planning trinity. And this is what I've been teaching a lot of our students on the undergraduate program now. These three separate distinct characters of development management, forward planning and enforcement. And we can see all of these things being pulled through now into marine spatial planning as well, with the idea that this is all very much situated within a national designated competent planning authority. So for England and Wales, the Marine Management Organisation, and for the South of Ireland, then that's the department, so DHLGH as well. And that is all sort of followed by high-level plans and policies coming underneath. So there are some similarities from that respect. So we talk about the progression of marine planning. So is marine spatial planning currently situated within the 21st century? And we would think with all the advancements in data and technology that we could say that, or is it a system that is still very much in its infancy? Is it in an embryonic state? Whatever way we view it, I think we all know that it's inherently political in character as well. In terms of stakeholder engagement in the marine environment, and this is where a lot of my PhD research was based on, I think it's really important to note that we might be considering different stakeholders. There might be more stakeholders, and maybe we need to engage with stakeholders a little differently than how we do on land use planning. I think the starting point for stakeholder engagement is also a little bit different as well. I think at the very start of marine spatial planning, we saw a lot of engagement from the scientific community. But I think as we've progressed throughout the years, there's more and more social sciences becoming integrated into stakeholder engagement as well. Now, this is really to highlight, this is a horrendogram, not by me, I have to say, by Boyles and Elliott in Swansea, but it's just to really note maybe the system isn't as embryonic as we first thought it was. And I know that there are a lot of these diagrams floating about, but it's just really hard hitting here to see all the different sort of governance streams. And in a couple of weeks' time, my colleague, my former PhD student, Dr. Kofi Ansung, will actually show something similar for this for Ireland that he looked at in his research. I'm not going to read all of this out, but I think it's just to point out that a lot has been happening in the UK and Ireland over the past 20 years. And it's just to say there are a lot of firsts, and it's really, really exciting. There's so much happening in this field. So how are we doing MSP? So as I indicated at the start, we're all taking slightly different approaches. So brand new planning systems being created. We're not doing it like other European countries. We see in Germany that they're doing more of an integrated system with their land use plans as well. But I think it's safe to say that, you know, in the UK, we are maybe slightly further ahead than Ireland, well, for most of the UK anyway, but I think we are on a general catch-up with lots of other countries as well. I'm going to take a quick whiz through now what's happening in the rest of the UK in terms of their plans, just to highlight this. I have to say I've borrowed a lot of these next slides from here, there, and everywhere. In the UK, we are using the Marine and Coastal Access Act from 2009, and then there is additional legislation from the Marine Act Scotland 2010 and the Northern Ireland Marine Act as well in 2013. And in England, there were 11 plans published by 2021, and you can see the coverage of them there. So we'll not look at all of them, but just to say that this is how the 4 competent authorities for the UK are divided up. You can see Marine Scotland, DAERA in Northern Ireland, the Welsh Assembly Government, and then the Marine Management Organisation as well. And then you can see a lovely donut around the Isle of Man, as it is not part of the UK. And just to show you what one of the plans look like then, so this is an example of one of the last plans that was published by the MMO. This is the Northwest Inshore and Offshore, and it was probably strategically left until the last plan to be published because it is quite complex because of those transboundary borders that they have to take into account for this for Scotland and for Wales as well. This is the lovely Welsh National Plan as well. And maybe just something to note as well, all these plans have marine plan visions. And whilst they're all vaguely similar, they all are a little bit different in terms of them. And that just reflects the devolved administrations, that they have the freedom to produce their own plans and their own visions as well. So Scotland was probably the furthest ahead in terms of its plan. So Marine Scotland produced its first national marine plan in 2019. And then you can see there that they have plans for 11 further regional marine plans. And then if you look down on the left there, you can see separate sector plans as well. And I think there's probably some similarity there with the DMAPs that are coming out in Ireland quite soon. Just to note then that actually Marine Scotland are developing their next iteration of a national marine plan. And I think this is in recognition that actually so much has changed from 2015. I think just to recognise that we're much more knowledgeable about the global climate emergency, biodiversity crisis, and a need for energy security as well. So there will be a new plan coming out soon. And then just really to highlight that the regional plans, they're continued to work on them. There are 3 that are well progressed now for Shetland, Clyde and Orkney. So the Isle of Man obviously doesn't follow UK legislation. It has its own Manx legislation. They do follow international conventions. And as such, they have no plans to have a sort of separate marine spatial plan at the minute. But they do have almost like a compendium of an EIA that they have built up so that they have, when they get an application, they can go and refer to that as well. But important to note really that the Isle of Man, obviously central within the RC, a busy maritime area as well, and you can see a lot of different activities happening there. So here is Ireland, and contrary to popular belief, there is another bit just on the top that I will talk about today. But this is just to say that you can see that there's an absolutely enormous amount of space around the island of Ireland. And I'll not be dealing with that because, as Terry said, we are going to have some of our colleagues from the department, from MARA, from DEC, and from Onboard Planola that are going to discuss the Irish situation over the coming weeks. So really, just to highlight here that in Northern Ireland, we have a draft plan since 2018. The second iteration is currently being consulted on. And this is again in recognition that there has been so much change since 2018. Similar to that sort of Scottish position that we now need to acknowledge that we're, very much reflecting on the climate emergency, the biodiversity crisis, and of course Brexit as well. And the Northern Ireland cases is so interesting because of the transboundary issues as well are very much unresolved. So there's a lot of discussions to be done there, potentially, or especially on Lough Foyle. And again, as I've said, my colleague Kofi will be talking about a case study on this in a few weeks' time. Hopefully, just over the course of the last sort of 20 minutes or so, I have sort of communicated that this is such an exciting opportunity for planners to be in. And it's really, really exciting field to be looking at. And there's so much more to be done on that. And whatever profession that you're in, it should be exciting to be involved in this. And especially, I think, if you're a planner as well. And we can see that, looking back to what Jim Claydon had said, the planning skills that we have in terms of foresight, understanding policy, integration, participation for stakeholders, and sustainability. These are all skills that we have developed from land use planning, and they can be transferred to our work now in the marine, but just with that appreciation that we are going to be working in entirely different environments. Really, just to recap then, I think it's just safe to say that there are so many different planning systems being developed at once, well, in slightly different time scales. But there is so much happening in terms of our legislation, our marine planning authorities, our actual plans, very much first generation status. A lot of them are very high level and very strategic. We will be moving to second iterations, and there will be sort of more maybe ideas of spatial prioritization coming out in those. And of course, just a recognition that we're working towards very high level targets and in very tight time frames as well. And I guess just to highlight a couple here, as I said, I am a real nerd about this stuff, and I do love some real academic papers to look at this. So I thought I would just share 2 of my favourites. So again, just the one from Town Planning Review from Deborah Peel and Greg Lloyd and then another one from CARE, looking at planning at the edge, so a little bit on the sort of land-sea divide. And then I thought I would just include a paper that my colleague Linda McElduff and Kofi Anson at Ulster, this was one of the last projects I did just before I left Ulster. So we had been funded from the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund to carry out a piece of work for DAERA in Northern Ireland, looking at transboundary spatial planning across the Irish Sea. I also included that UNESCO report as well, because it is so interesting in terms of taking a really international perspective, looking at lots of different case studies and many different guiding principles, really informing marine spatial planning. And then my good colleague Cormac Walsh did this recent publication for the North and Western Regional Assembly, just looking at the idea of MSP and the preparation of those DMAPs. So that's available, all of those are available online. And then finally, I thought I would just finish off with my own publications as well. So hopefully you should be able to access most of them. If not, you can drop me an email and I will send those on to you. So Terry, that is everything from me. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will let Paul get his presentation uploaded. Oh, Terry, you're muted.
The story of my life. Thank you very much, Heather, for that very interesting overview. And thank you also for the very valuable resources that you've given everybody that we'll be able to follow up on. So Paul is going to give us a presentation now on land-sea interactions. And I think also, Paul, you're going to give us a best case example as well.
Yes, yes, that's right.
Paul is a lecturer in spatial planning in TUD. He lectures on both the undergraduate and the postgrad courses. His research interests include climate adaptation and land use and marine planning. And Paul is currently completing a PhD in the University of Ulster, and that's on the role of community and voluntary sector in climate adaptation in coastal areas. So it's a very closely allied to marine spatial planning. Paul is another member of the MSP committee as well, and a member of the IPI.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Terry. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen now. I think I'll get straight into the presentation because a half an hour goes by quickly. If I could find it. One second. Oh, technical difficulties. Hold on 1 second. Okay. Great. Okay, apologies for that. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about land-sea interactions. Now, as Heather was saying about marine spatial planning, what most of you probably think about when you hear about marine spatial planning, you think about those zoning maps or maps which show you different marine uses on the sea. But there's another part of it too, which I'm going to speak about today, which is the part that affects what's called the near coastal zone. And this, first off, one of the other difficulties with marine spatial planning is that quite a lot of it is debatable. Whereby when we talk about the near coastal zone, there are a range of definitions, particularly about the extent of it, because its boundaries are undefined and the definition is debated. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the definition accepted by the European Environmental Agency, and it's the part of the land affected by its proximity to the sea, and the parts of the sea affected by its proximity to the land as the extent to which man's land-based activities have a measurable influence on water chemistry and marine ecology. And basically, whatever happens on land, particularly for the marine area that's right adjacent to the land-based activities have a very significant implication for it and its environmental quality. And now, one thing that we can agree on is that the coastal zones, they're in trouble. They occupy the interface between marine and terrestrial areas, and they've been described as very highly diverse and truly unique multifunctional natural areas. And they're also critical habitats. They've been described also as nurseries for where fish and other aquatic species begin life. So you know, if they decline in quality, it can endanger biodiversity very significantly. The other thing is, of course, they provide very significant ecosystem services. So they're in terms of cleaning water and cleaning air and so on, and indeed storing carbon as well. But luckily enough, we, the environmental sensitivity and the crucial ecological role is now recognised, but the pressures on them are continually increasing. We're all aware that not only are human populations expanding, but they're also expanding in coastal areas much more than in other areas. Everybody wants to live beside the sea. And of course, in terms of your economic activities that take place, there's more and more of them taking place in coastal areas too. And we know, of course, as well that most of our major cities in the world are in coastal locations as well. And on top of all that, then we have climate change. So we have pressures from the seaward side too, such as sea level rise, higher sea temperatures, and more frequent and intense weather events as well. Now, as a result of all that, the coastal zones are under serious pressure. And in order to try and work out the pressures that they face, what we need to focus on is what are called the various impact chains that affect them. In other words, the pressures that arise on land, or I suppose the nutrients or the pollutants or whatever that arise on land that end up in the sea, because they're the ones that generate negative impacts on the water quality and undermine the habitat integrity. So managing these land-sea interactions is a key part of marine spatial planning, because, of course, at its core, marine spatial planning means delivering a better quality marine environment. So the intense pressures then the coastal areas face, combined with up until now, and Heather referred to it in our talk, what have been ineffective management systems, they've led commentators to conclude that these coastal zones are among the most transformed and imperiled social ecological systems on Earth, and they're characterized by unsustainable practices. So they're the exact areas that we need very good, effective governance systems for, but it's getting these systems has proved to be a challenge. And not just Ireland, many countries are actually struggling with this to try and come up with systems that work, that are going to control these impact chains. And the reason why it's so hard to design these systems is the systems have to deal with this interconnectedness of land and sea. And we know from Heather's talk that the characteristics of land and sea differ so much, it can be a very, very tricky process indeed. Now, basically, the solution, or I suppose the way forward, if you like, is to manage these diverse impact chains. In other words, when the nutrients or pollutants or whatever arise on land and go on to generate negative impacts on the ecological health of the marine and coastal environment, we have to try and control these impact chains and ensure that the impact is minimal or avoided. And this is particularly urgent now, as a result of the fact that as EU member states, we're committed to achieving good environmental status under MSFD, that's the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And indeed, there's a deadline for us to do that as well. But the EU have also acknowledged that there are problems with managing land-sea interactions, and there's an appreciation that effective governance systems are needed. However, what's holding us back in many respects is we have very limited experience of doing this. There's lots of coastal governance systems and arrangements in the EU and elsewhere as well. But when compared to land-based or terrestrial areas, we don't have a breadth of experience. We don't have a huge amount of knowledge on what works best. So MSD implementation has brought this issue into sharp focus, as member states in particular are grappling with it. And given that there's so many different arrangements throughout Europe, how land-sea interactions are handled in the marine and coastal management regimes in European countries, it's of strong interest to everyone. And there's been an effort in recent years to find out which ones have worked best. And indeed, this was the focus of the Cost Action Network. I myself was a member of it, and that ran between 2016 And I think it ran until 2021 as a result of the pandemic. The tail end of it was in the pandemic. Anyway, basically, this was seen to be a good forum to explore this issue because, of course, there were researchers in the research network from all EU member states, so they're well placed to investigate how different EU countries were approaching and dealing with the issues surrounding coastal and marine governance. There was a range of different pieces of research, papers, and so on that were done. I have a sources slide at the end. I'll point you in the direction of them if anybody wants to read up on them. But anyway, they found that there was EU member states faced a lot of similar problems, and you've had a foretaste of them already from Heather. The fragmentation of marine responsibilities was a very big one, whereby you had different government departments, different government agencies, all of which had a responsibility towards clean marine water and so on. And this was a barrier to achieving their objectives. Integrated coastal zone management approaches were also popular throughout the EU, and the countries who adopted these integrated coastal zone management approaches in 2002, that data is significant as it was in response to an EU recommendation that wasn't mandatory. So not all countries adopted it, but the ones that did, places like France, Spain, and Germany, the research revealed that they're now furthest ahead because the governance systems that they took in place or that they put into place, which were trying to implement integrated coastal zone management approaches, they've evolved and they've continued to progress as well. So anyway, as a result of that, as a result of the early movers on it, a two-speed Europe for MSP is emerging, or has emerged, if you like, with some countries leading the way by preparing area-based plans, which are backed up by comprehensive data sets, while others remain further behind with high national level aspirational plans that are very difficult to implement in practice. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you about the best practice examples that we discovered. We found one which was of interest, and that was, it seemed to be based on the researchers that undertook undertook the case study. It was the Thau Lagoon in southeastern France on the Mediterranean, and I'll tell you all about that now. Okay, so first off, hopefully you can see the map. My screen is blocking it, but the map is significant because it shows you the physical characteristics of the coastal area. It's actually a lagoon. It's located on the Mediterranean close to Montpellier in France. The case study considers coastal marine governments at a subnational level. So this is a local level case study, and it kind of has to be, and you'll understand why by the time we get to the end of these 5 or 6 slides. The coastal marine area is a stream-fed, semi-enclosed karst lagoon that is connected to the Mediterranean Sea by 2 small inlets. So I suppose the physical characteristics are very important because it doesn't have, the connections to the sea are actually minimal. So that means then that, you know, any nutrient loading that happens in the water body as a result of runoff from the surrounding lands, it basically stays in the lagoon. So it is vulnerable in that respect, as the dilution effect will be much lower than it would be in other marine locations or in other marine areas. The other thing is, well, it's in southeastern France, so there's a range of economic activity that take place. The ones that you would expect in that location, they have oyster farming and fishing, obviously. They have, and in the area surrounding the lagoon, you've got agricultural activities such as viticulture, which is the cultivation of grapes, horticulture, and livestock. And tourism is important too. Not only that, there's plenty of urbanization taking place as well. And that is understood to be having an increasingly negative impact on the environmental quality of the lagoon, and is believed to be substituting agricultural pressures from the area. So all of these influences are having an impact on the lagoon, and a negative impact too. So what were the challenges that they had to try and address? Well, the first one, the biggest one really, was the water quality. It was believed that nutrient-rich surface water and groundwater coming off the land, coming off the surrounding land around the lagoon, was being discharged into the lagoon where the natural conditions, basically it's enclosed nature, which reduced the dilution effect from the surrounding waters. It was leading to elevated levels of nutrients. The nitrate-rich waters then posed a threat to oyster farming. The productivity of the oyster farms in the location was declining. And it was also starting to threaten other functions such as fishing and tourism as well. As you know, you need classifications such as blue flag beaches and so on. And they were worried that all of these things, that in other words, the lagoon wasn't going to be able to fulfill the functions that it had fulfilled up until this point, or up until now. And it was also feared that the usability of the beach and its use by tourists and surrounding residents could be threatened by declining water quality. So they're in trouble. So basically, so what did they do? Well, the first port of call is the governance structure itself. This is important because any solution that you're going to come up with is going to have to go through the governance structure. And it would be very similar to what we would expect as planners. It has your typical hierarchical levels in it. It was comprehensive and with plenty of multi-scales from municipal level to intermunicipal level to departmental level to regional and national level, all of which have objectives which are handed down through the hierarchy. But I suppose, as you probably would expect, this is where your fragmentation comes in. The governance arrangements often led to responsibilities for key issues, such as water quality, which is the key one here, been spread out across many organizations and stakeholders throughout the governance structure. So you had different government departments, municipal authorities, and other organizations, all of whom were using different mechanisms to monitor and deliver on the key environmental criteria, specifically water quality. So this feature of governance had led to fragmented responsibilities, which have been discharged without integration and without common purpose. And in short, it wasn't leading to the optimum outcome, which was clean water or good quality water in the lagoon. And they weren't getting the better environmental quality that wasn't been delivered. So well, what did they do? Well, now you appreciate that it was quite a complicated response to the whole problem, and I've tried to break it down into a fairly understandable 5-step process. I'm sure it wasn't quite as straightforward as this when they did it. But anyway, basically the 5-step process is as follows. It was described as an innovative process. I'll describe each step in turn. But the first step was they set up what was called a brokerage agency, and that was the SMBT, which is the acronym for the French name. And their job was to devise coastal and marine environmental management solutions for the lagoon and to ensure that all of the stakeholders with governance responsibilities adopted an integrated approach to managing the lagoon. So you're probably all hearing this and saying, yeah, well, that sounds all very familiar. But it's the way they did it really, which is of interest. And I'll tell you about the 5 steps now. So the first thing they did was SMBT was set up. They were a new government agency, and they had to design and implement a new management process. And the first things that I want to draw your attention to is its makeup, its composition. And its makeup and composition was purely intended to enable it to complete this innovative management process. Firstly, the employees of the agency had a wide breadth of management experience. So they appear to have taken, I'm fairly sure they've taken management figures from all of the other management levels in the lagoon, whether it was in that local area or other areas. They understood how the management layers work. So the brokerage agency, who were responsible for delivering this new management process, had a very clear understanding of the management or the governance structure that they were going to be working in. Secondly, then, a high proportion of the staff had technical qualifications rather than administrative qualifications. And many technical staff also had this decision-making roles. There was a lot of scientists. There was, whether they're hydrologists, marine hydrologists, ecologists, all of whom had very technical qualifications. And that was intentional as well. And it's because of the focus on data, which you'll hear about in the next step. And the third point is then the agency was multidisciplinary with a wide range of highly skilled PhD level staff members. This meant that SMBT was comfortable with data, which is a key point. You'll see why next. So once they had SMBT up and running and their staff complement in place, they set out to ensure that better environmental outcomes were being achieved. That was their key task, was to make sure that the water quality could be improved or could reach a level that all activities in the lagoon could be supported, including oyster farming. As a result, extensive data sets on key environmental indicators, such as water quality, soil composition, fish and shellfish stocks, and so on, they all had to be gathered from the lagoon. So that was their first task, to put together all of these data sets. And they're what are called data sets with local specificity. They were specific to this area. The other thing they did was data sets on the major influences on the environmental indicators were also necessary. So as a result, all land uses in the watershed, which would have been, i.e. the basin that surrounds and adjoins the lagoon, they were recorded and they were mapped, and that would include agriculture, and that would include the viticulture. And not only that, they recorded all of the inputs that were used in the land, the fertilizers that were used, the pesticides that were used, and so on. The end result, I conducted an interview with one of the researchers who looked at this case study in the COST network, and he described it as one of the most studied areas in France. So, thirdly, this is where your impact chains or your impact tracing comes in. Once they had the data sets, they knew what was in the water, basically. They knew what was coming off the land and getting into the water. So they had to find out where it was arising, where it was coming from. So they started to trace back the impact chains. In other words, they were identifying the source of the nutrients that were ended up in the lagoon and leading to these higher nitrate loads. And of course, this step wouldn't have been possible if they hadn't gone through step one, which was compiling the data sets in the first place. Believe it or not, this also meant that SMBT staff members adopted what was called a participatory management approach, whereby they met farmers, they met the wine growers, they met other land users in the adjoining area in order to find out how they were using their land, and which, of course, these land use patterns were influencing the lagoon and the environmental quality of the lagoon. And the purpose of this step was to establish the land use management process so that appropriate management solutions could be agreed. So it's very, very much focused on data and putting all this data together. Then the fourth step is once they knew what was getting into the lagoon, once they knew where that was coming from, step 4 was devising appropriate management mechanisms. So this involved drawing up an area-based action strategy, and there's multiple layers on it, multiple map layers on it, and it showed all of the land uses of the basin adjacent to the lagoon. And management approaches then for managing the different land uses, which included issues like agreeing time intervals during which fertilizers could be spread or pesticides could be added or used, and indeed what type of fertilizers and pesticides, as this was seen as a key determinant of the water quality. This was having a direct influence on the water quality in the lagoon. You know, I suppose to add controls, they were quite prescriptive. They were prescriptive in terms of the land management approaches. They signed agreements with land users called, I can't actually see, anyway, I think they're called integrated management contracts, and they were signed with the stakeholders, in other words, the landowners, while terms of use with respect to water management in the basin were also agreed. So everybody needs to be very clear as well that it did lead to controls on how the land was used around the lagoon as well. And then the highly specific local data sets that have been gathered then enabled performance criteria to be developed. So once they'd gone through this exercise, they knew what the threshold was. They knew how many the threshold for nutrients in the lagoon was. They knew how much nutrients the water could accommodate while it supported all of the different functions on that. And of course, if that threshold was passed, well, then the water quality would decline, and the different functions then will be threatened. So they had the prescribed standard identified, and it was a matter then of meeting it. And of course, it was a matter of meeting it at specific times of the year, because of course it would differ during the winter months when rainfall levels were higher than during the summer months when rainfall levels were lower. As the water quality was known and the major influences on it and now been established, it was now possible to continuously monitor the water and other environmental indicators to ensure a consistent standard throughout the year. So they adopted a participatory management approach centered around an area-based action plan these integrated management contracts and basically performance criteria for key environmental indicators. So the key thing about all this is that, their performance criteria, they weren't static. It's not simply a statement saying they were looking for better water quality. It was much more specific than that, and much more dynamic than that, whereby the performance criteria changed from season to season, and there was continuous monitoring throughout. They ensured that all of the governance actors and stakeholders in land and lagoon management understood their roles and their responsibilities in the governance system. It is important to note that all stakeholders were given management roles. Yeah, I suppose this is another, important point, whereby because there is a multi-scalar government approach whereby you have municipal authorities, you also had voluntary sectors, but the voluntary sectors would have been things like fishermen's guilds and so on. They all had management responsibilities or stewardship roles, whereby they themselves had the most to lose if the water quality dipped below a certain level. So they were particularly proactive in monitoring the water quality. And this is known as co-management of the marine resource. So this is consistent with the participatory management approach. They did this on the basis that it involved everybody, the joint responsibility for the water quality. And it perhaps explains as well why the CMT did not engage in reform or streamlining, which may have threatened some of the stakeholders. I suppose that's an important point too, whereby, once SMBT was established as a brokerage agency, they were keen to point out that they weren't being set up as an alternative to the other layers, but they were being set up to ensure that the other layers worked better with respect to water quality. And what were the outcomes? So I'm almost finished. Well, the in-depth and integrated management process is understood to have led to an improvement in key environmental indicators in the Tail Lagoon, and it's enabled the many activities in the area to continue without creating harm to the marine resource. And I suppose as another vote of confidence in SMBT and the approach that they took, they were deemed to be very successful, and the organisation was considered to be very effective in carrying out its tasks. And as a result of that, they were allocated new and additional functions in relation to flood management or flood and biodiversity management, as both of these issues were believed to be suited to the SMB approach that they'd followed for water quality. So I just want to run through a couple of negatives and positives of it, and then I'll give you the sources. So there's no doubt that the approach has its drawbacks, because it would have been incredibly expensive. There's no doubt about it. The approach required huge resources in terms of, first of all, the staff complement. You needed highly skilled multidisciplinary staff. There was a very big reliance on extensive and locally specific data sets on key environmental indicators, which would have taken time, effort, and certainly money as well to put together. There was also a requirement for labor-intensive participatory management approaches that would have been working with the land users around the lagoon. And then, of course, once all that is done, there is a need for continuous monitoring to ensure that the threshold for water quality remains at a consistent level. The above requirements may mean, and there seems little doubt that this is a best practice approach, and it's been identified a best practice approach. But given the amount of resources, it may mean that the approach is not suitable, or it could not be justified for all areas, but it may be an option in areas that require higher levels of monitoring. And the big positive is, I suppose, is that it worked. And it's one of the few examples that we have, or that the Coast Network at least was able to identify, of where a management approach to a marine or coast area has delivered improvements to the marine environment. And it was recognized as such in the Coast Network. And the sources I've three sources there. Basically, the first source is the book. The book was produced. It's a compilation of the research that was done within the Coast Network. The Evolutions in Estuary Governance is it's a description of actually there are three cases in it, one of which is the Tail Lagoon in France, and there's also a reference there for the Marine Policy Special Edition, which focuses on land sea interaction and coastal development, which has a number of other articles as well as the Evolutions in Estuary Governance, and I can make those available if need be. That's it, Terry.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much for that very interesting case study, and also for giving your sources and for drawing what are really, really very relevant conclusions from it. We have a number of questions. Just to say at the outset, we've one question asking, will the slides be shared afterwards? They will indeed.
Yes.
They'll be made available with the presentations. So one of the first questions, Heather, for you, is there currently a link between MSP and a coastal community's regional development planning?
Yeah, so I think the big thing here is to mention integrated coastal zone management. And, you know, that has never really been properly implemented. There are some sort of non-statutory strategies out there. But I think what we see now is much more integration between the marine plans coming forward and the new land use plans coming as well. And there is an appreciation that what is stated in a land use plan